Okay, so what I'm going to do in the short session is to focus on a report that we produced in conjunction with a colleague of ours called Robert. I nearly said Robert. Don't tell me I said that. Roger Kline, and it's really about the way in which the NHS handles race and racism. But although we focus on the NHS, the learning and recommendation are really applicable to many organisations if they are in the business of supporting their work on race and racism, both internally but also externally in terms of population change. And the other thing that the report does, it also speaks of the culture of organisations and highlights what we should be doing, what we should be ditching if we really want to try and address workplace equality. So I know that Priscilla gave me a little bit of introduction, but let me just add in by saying a little bit about the organisation that I work for. So we're called BRAP. It's not an acronym. We've been around for 25 years. This is our 25th birthday year. So we're doing quite a few things. So if you want to look on our website, you can see some of the things we're doing in this 25th year. But our mission really is to transform the way that we think about and we practice equality. And part of the reason we think that transformation is important is because a lot of what we do, even though we want to do really good work in this area, it's pedestrian at best. It doesn't really do the change that we need to do. And we really believe a better society is possible. We think that we need to examine what we do. We spend a lot of time in our organisations, manipulating figures, reporting on change or lack of change, and very rarely does anything change. And what we're into as an organisation is working with the complexity. So we partner and we work with organisations who are interested in how we can shift some of this style. How can we open up some of the things we do in our organisations to more tech change, and what do we think we need to do to learn and to grow in terms of our understanding of some of these intractable issues. So that's a bit about us. So I wanted to start off by answering this question, what race has got to do with it? So when I started to look at London stats, you probably would recognise that I'm a Brummie. I have a Birmingham accent, which I'm very proud of. But actually, the organisation works all over the place. So we're based in Birmingham, but we work all over the country, and we do quite a lot of work in London. And many of you will know, if you're on this call, that not only does ethnicity play a significant role in shaping experiences of poverty and inequality, but also shaping life chances. When I looked at your tube map, some of the gaps in terms of life expectancy, they kind of move in the wrong direction from station to station. And more ethnic groups are disproportionately affected by socioeconomic deprivation. And that's a kind of key determinant of health status across all communities. But also, and this was another stat that I picked up, is that 43% of Black and 33% of Asian Londoners report being treated unfairly due to their ethnicity, in comparison to 12% for the London population generally. So most of us will know that as much as we want to say racism hasn't gone away, it hasn't gone away. It's kind of stuck. It's a little bit like a sleeping giant. We just, we think we might have disappeared, but it appears not only periodically, but for some people, there's a daily experience of racism, which is obviously very grueling. So let me talk to you a little bit about why I think this report is relevant, not just to NHS organisations, and a lot of the information has been built around NHS organisations, but because NHS organisations really don't do anything very differently from lots of other organisations when they're trying to address racism. So we think that the findings are really applicable across the board. So many of you may have heard of Toni Morrison, and one of her quotes, I've only paraphrased a little bit here, is she says that the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. And what she means by that is that we're continually trying to prove racism, how much of it, how deep it is, where it is, how does it show up. And that kind of work where we're constantly kind of going, is it happening here? It's distraction. And one of the things we didn't want to do with this report was to set out to prove racism. We didn't intend to, because we know that racism exists. So it starts off the report by saying, we're not proving it, we know racism exists. So what we're trying to do is we try to capture the experiences of over 1,300 people who answered the survey when they tried to raise concerns of racism. So the NHS, like many other organisations, it says, we want to know about it. Let us know when racism happens. And what these 1,300 people did who answered the survey was talk to us about what happens when they try to raise it. It also brings together tribunal findings as learnings for the NHS in the failings of how they respond to racism. So the tribunal findings bit of the report is the thing that people find quite fascinating, because it does bring out what organisations really need to be doing if they're going to take racism seriously, not because they want to keep themselves out of the court or out of the paper, but because actually we know that many organisations say they want to do something to address racism, but there's lots of stuff that they're doing that's really holding them back. And this is really what that report juxtaposes, the difference between the intent and the impact. What is it that I really am doing in order to address racism within our organisation? So I'm not going to leave this stand up very long, but we asked people, if you experienced racism within your organisation, what form did it take? And you can see that what is happening here is that there is some of this race-based joke stuff happening, so people being subject to jokes about their race. But actually, lots of racism is now undercover, it's covert. It comes in the form of additional scrutiny. So when I'm doing something, I get more scrutiny, more people asking me, more people looking at me than I might do if I was a white leader or was like white manager. If I'm in authority, people question my authority more than they do if I was a white manager. Promotion opportunities are uneven and don't feel as if they're fairly distributed. I'm not being called by my name, whatever my name is. There's a lack of information. I remember somebody saying to me, information is power. And some of the cases go into the fact that actually not getting information means it leaves you powerless. It means that you're not able to do your job well. Generalizations and stereotypes. Colleagues are sometimes speaking more rudely, and lots of assumptions that are made made about me because of my race. So in the report, you'll see lots of examples of where and how some of this stuff actually shows up. And in summary, then, what people are saying is there's a real lack of development opportunities, that the relationships that I have with colleagues, the things that happen to me on a day-to-day basis are littered with microaggressions. And if people don't know what microaggressions are, or micro incivilities, it's not the overt racism that you often see at football matches or cricket. Actually, cricket has that as well. It's the stuff where people are giving you more scrutiny, people are asking you more questions, where you can see that something that happens to another colleague who might be white doesn't happen to you in the same way. So they become a tiny little bit more difficult to identify, but I would argue that they're really clear. The part of the problem is that we find it really difficult to act on them. And without acting on what I consider to be everyday racism, what happens is that we end up we sit on top of cultures where racism is inculcated around us. The other thing that comes out of this report is there's lots of barriers to raising concerns. So when you go and you say to your manager, you know what, I think I'm having an experience of racism, some of the things that people say might be, well, are you sure about that? They might just have an off day, or they're like that with everyone, or, you know, you're being a bit touchy. So despite organisations saying we want to hear about it, we want to stop it, when people come forward to raise issues of racism, they get put down, they get put off. And as a consequence, people report that there's little point in raising concerns because nothing happens. And there's also little support from those who are there to offer it. So many organisations have people like Freedom to Speak Up guardians. Lots of organisations have human resource colleagues or business partners and trade unions. And even those go-to people find it difficult to accept racism is happening and are often stumped in terms of how they take it forward. So barriers to raising concern, again, this was coming out of the survey. And the biggest thing you can see is I didn't believe anything would change. So for many people, they're sitting in the organisation, experiencing day-to-day incivilities from their colleagues or from patients or from service users or from whatever, and they don't know how to make any difference to their life. So they're basically sitting with the problem, don't want to be seen as a troublemaker, worried about repercussions. So if these are people who are residents, you know, that whole relationship of power also means that people are often putting up with things that they don't really want to be able to put up with, but don't feel there's anywhere for them to go because of repercussions or because they don't think that things are going to change very much. So the tribunal cases, there have been some high profile tribunal cases over the last year. We kind of did a selection of this, and this was kind of Roger's kind of key area in looking at these cases. And we also had some of the legalities checked by a colleague of ours from Kline. And what we found so these were tribunal cases which found in the favour of those people who had brought the allegation. So this is the little person winning against a huge organisation. And some of the things that the tribunals have said is that discrimination is rarely admitted, and that be obvious to people. But in some of the cases, it was so obvious that it was discrimination that actually the organisation should just held its hands up and said, you know what, this is discrimination. We're not even going to defend it. The second point is that very little discrimination is overt or deliberate, and I've gone through that again. Previously I've talked a little bit about that kind of everyday racism. But in the case where organisations are saying, you know, we're finding it really difficult to really understand if that is racism, if it was just somebody having a bad day, what the courts say is actually you have an obligation as an organisation to look at the track record of your organisation, to look at whether or not the things that people are talking about is an exception, or whether racism is littered through your organisation culture. What many people find is that there is past and current experiences of racism. So very few organisations have the type of organisation where they can say, you know what, we need to second guess whether people are experiencing race discrimination. Most organisations have the opposite, which is they're finding it difficult to be free of racism because it's popping up all over the place. They can see it in the organisational structure. They've got loads of experiences and complaints. So what tribunals are saying is that you need to look at that. You need to weigh up the evidence. You need to think, actually, there's a good chance here that what this person is saying is borne out as true because the culture of the organisation is not free of racism. The other thing that tribunals have said is staff struggle to talk about race. And I think this is a huge indication of our inability to do anything about it. If we can't talk about it, if we don't have any fluidity, if we're scared of being called out for using the wrong name or whatever, then how are we addressing it? How are we being able to spot it? How are we actually developing our competency and capability? This point's made a little bit by the point I made previously, but employers generally want to look at an individual event. So 3 individual staff claim racism. They kind of look at staff 1, staff 2, staff 3. They don't actually look at there's 3 staff. What does this mean about the admin division? Or what does this mean about estates? Or what does this mean about X or Y? So organisations need to triangulate. They need to look at cumulative patterns of behaviours. And employers often set a high bar, needing to see deliberate discrimination. So I don't know about you, but when I start in an organisation, I don't kind of go, right, I'm going to write down everything everybody says to me. I'm going to keep every email so that at some point in my future, if I get a racist experience, I can look back and I can get the evidence so that I can demonstrate that. People tend not to think like that. So when employers try to look for evidence, they need to think more critically about what they're doing to support the culture of their organisation to be free of covert discrimination. So they set the bar too high. And what employment tribunals are saying is that actually, it's your responsibility. You've got to tell me how you have enabled this person in your organisation to have a really good time at work, to come to work and feel as if they don't have to put up with, racist comments. They don't have to look at experience some of the covert discrimination within their organisations. And if you can't tell me that, then the onus is on you, not on the individual, to prove that they've had a racist experience. Another common failure is in investigations, and we see this across the board. Where race is concerned, really poor quality for all of the reasons I've mentioned beforehand. And what some organisations have taken to doing, they've said, I know what we'll do. We will stick somebody who is from a black or brown or minority ethnic background on the investigation panel, and that means it's going to be unbiased. And what tribunals are saying, it's still a rubbish investigation. It doesn't matter who does it. So there's something there about noting the importance of having a thorough investigation process and people with skills to do it. Employers are aware of the legal framework, the burden of proof, the fact that they have to prove the kind of cultures that they create, and that for the NHS in particular, this might not apply for everybody in the core, that there's responsibility for contract staff. So for people who are contracted to you under employment under the Equality Act, you also are responsible for what they're doing. And finally, courts regularly criticise HR staff for falling short of expectations in terms of their understanding and ability to act on race discrimination. So when you go to HR don't have the skills. They're also part of the system where it's asking for proof, asking for evidence, dragging it out 2, 3, 4 years. And as a consequence of that, the damage that's done to people is quite serious, actually, in terms of their experiences of trying to uphold an allegation. So there's a persistence of racism. So huge denial. So organisations deny it even when it's really obvious. There's a reluctance or a refusal to acknowledge race as an issue. Minimisation of harm. So employers don't recognise that people, it's a lot of effort. It takes a lot out of your life to, first of all, raise it, and secondly, keep going with it as you go through an employer process of of raising it under, whether it be the Equality Act or whether it be under grievance and disciplinary, it drags out, and you've got to keep going in and you've got to keep going at this while you're also doing your day-to-day job. And as a consequence, there's a real lack of empathy and actually a tendency for employers to empathise with the alleged party rather than the victim of racism. There's an assumption of fairness. This is a huge assumption. That if you've got a policy and if you've got a process and if you follow the policy and process, then that's a demonstration of fairness. And employment tribunals invariably find that organisations are hung out to dry because they can't usually follow their own policies, but also policies do not equal that people are actually having a fair time within their organisations. There's some stuff when you read some of these employment tribunals where people are actually using stereotypes to describe individuals. So she was an angry black woman, which is why I felt that, this needed to happen. And tribunals have been able to say, what do you mean that? So almost some of the witnesses who have come to defend themselves don't realise that some of the things they're doing are actually incorporating stereotypes as part of their defence. And that whole fear, as I said, around discussing race and racism. So one of the things that the report does is it kind of questions, and this is really where I think there's this opportunity. People have been saying to me, this is a really truthful report, Joy. What do we do about it? And this is the biggest change, I think, that is the hardest change to make. Many of the things that we do in supporting our attempts to be more fair as an organisation and to address issues of racism are what I would call as transactional, and there's a lot of evidence to support this. So transactional activities are things that they don't cause us any pain in a lot of it's a very crass description, but it doesn't really change the status quo. We collect data, we set targets for representation, and representation, I think it's Angela Davis has said, it's diversity is a corporate strategy. It's the difference that doesn't make a difference. So if it looks right, then it must be right. And actually, many of us know that just because things look a certain way doesn't necessarily mean they impact on the culture and the behaviours of organisation. We get into revamping policies, procedures, menus, events, celebrating diversity, ideas for days for everyone, mentoring, reverse mentoring, putting in place champions. So we do a load of activity, and then we wonder why things don't change. Transformational activity is longer term, it's more embedded, it's development, not training. It's really working the muscle of people that work in the organisations critically about their responsibilities and what they do. And you can already hear how hard that is and how easy it can be to get people to do the multiple choice questionnaire or to get people to consult for the 100th time with the, Black, Asian and minority ethnic group over there, than really changing what goes on within the organisation and the services that we deliver. So some of the things that we've summarised in terms of our learning is that we definitely need to think about racism as a structural issue. If we think about it structurally, we begin to see how it becomes very immune to technical fixes. So racism loves a tick box. It loves an action plan, because often it doesn't mean that those things are really gripping the issue. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be some accountability, but often it's the wrong type of accountability. And we really need to think about a different way of making ourselves accountable for change. We need to question the idea of fairness. If we've got the policy, it's fair. If we follow the recruitment process, it's fair. These things are helpful, but people can shift within the system, and it's people's operationalization of that stuff, which makes it unfair. Recognizing that we're still operating in stereotypes, and stereotypes become a way of seeing our world, despite all we say about diversity and intersectionality. We don't operate in those ideas. We operate in very linear, tick-boxy ways, which means that we continue to repeat some of those patterns and experiences. We have an ongoing fear of talking about race. And this, I think, is littered across all of our society, that we don't think we can do it. We don't think we have a right to do it. We don't think we can make a mistake. We don't think we can recover from mistakes. And unless we get better at that, we don't get better at addressing the issue. And I think one of the most important things, when somebody has a racist experience, we can't address it there and then. We, instead of kind of looking at it as a kind of low level, I'm not really talking about the experience, I'm talking about the opportunity at the lowest level to address it. So you didn't say my name right, or you made an assumption about me that was incorrect. Let us try and address that. It becomes an escalated issue. And because it is escalated, it also escalates the distress, it prevents learning, it goes up and up and up and up. So what it could have been dealt with very simply, I say simply because it's still hard to have the conversation, but it could have been dealt with at the lowest level. It's the escalation of it is part of the problem, and that escalates people's emotions, people's fear. It doesn't mean that we're creating healthier cultures or opportunities to address issues of racism. So the recommendations, we tried to be few in this, but first recommendation is stop doing things that make little difference. We're really good at adding things to our shopping lists, but we're really bad at stopping doing all the things that make absolutely no difference in our organisations in addressing racism. And we've got to think about the root causes of racism in order to get good at addressing it. I think there's a tendency to look at a toolkit approach. It's complex racism. You need development, not training. All of the sort of training stuff, I'm not suggesting all of it's useless. I wouldn't be as crass as to say that. I've not experienced all of it, but all I know is that we've been doing it for a long time and it's skimming the surface, and we need to somehow go deeper so that people can be good at talking about it, feel more uncomfortable, learn, and increase their competence around these agendas. Racism is present. It's present within our society. And I think that one of the things we need to be better at is saying we've got to work on it before it gets to the point where it affects the organisation, where it affects service users or patients or residents. So we need to be more proactive. We sit around and we wait for racism to happen rather than thinking how we can root it out before it happens. We need to set standards to address everyday racism and to take accountability if they're not adhered to. We've got to address, not dismiss allegations of racism. So if we hear an allegation, I'm not suggesting that we should just go, oh yeah, that must be true. I'm suggesting that we should be much more informed about the fact that racism shows up, and it will show up in our organisation. So if somebody comes and says, I've experienced it, take that seriously, listen, figure out what you can do about it. And if you can do something about it before going down the route of picking up the policy or, operating into the grievance or whatever, then do so. We've got to get comfortable with staff actually speaking up about racism rather than trying to minimise it. And we've got to develop staff capabilities, especially in areas like leadership and human resources, to be able to deal with racism, so that we these people who we have in these positions, when people go to them, they actually get more of a positive response to their concern. So that was a whistle-stop tour of a 63-page report. I hope that's been helpful in terms of setting some of the scenes that comes out of the report, and I'm really happy to take any questions that people may have in response. So thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Yeah, if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them now, or you can put them in the chat. So Serena, do you want to go ahead? Mic, there we go. Let me just allow everyone's mic. Do you want to try again, Serena?
Thank you.
There you go,
Thank you, Priscilla. You know, I don't like to feel like I've been muted, you know what I mean? Come on. I'm a Black woman who wants to speak. Joy, absolutely brilliant. Priscilla, I don't know if the camera's okay, brilliant.
Yeah,
wonderful.
I'm doing it. Yeah.
Joy, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I know we've only connected over email and we're yet to meet, but absolutely brilliant. And I think just, I've read the report. We've gone through with colleagues, we've looked at recommendations, we've looked at how is Westminster City Council doing in relation to those recommendations, but actually kind of hearing you talk through it it's just kind of added another layer. There were two things I just wanted to pick up and maybe to see if we could expand. One was I think this really, really kind of interesting point about how insidious, nasty and pervasive racism actually is. And when people are going about their normal day-to-day work, we're kind of always aware of the comments like, oh, this person's operating with a chip on their shoulder, or they are, like they're overly sensitive. So, kind of often people who identify as being from a global majority background are really like acutely aware of that. Just as how when you have caring responsibilities, you're acutely aware of how your colleagues are viewing you if you have to leave early on one day, right? So similar thing. And I just wondered, this kind of perception of seeing racism through increased kind of preoccupation with you, so I, in a leadership position, is there increased awareness of me as a leader? Because I happen to be a Black woman, kind of like additional scrutiny. And it's really, really difficult. It's such a thin line between saying, hold on, okay, I'm a leader, so there's a level of scrutiny I'm going to get anyway, because I'm kind of out there. And am I getting an additional? Is there an additional? And it's really, really difficult, one, to kind of voice that in a way that doesn't feel like it's, like you're going to be subject then to these things, but also like it's an internal conversation. Literally, when you said it, I was like, is this, I started to have that conversation with myself. That was one thing. And then the other thing was around accountability around anti-racism. So Westminster City Council, I'm conscious that other people are on the call as well, not from the council, but we launched as an anti-racist organisation maybe like about 2 years ago. And we were really clear that we wanted to be active in this space. We didn't want to be kind of sitting down. We wanted to kind of be proactive. But of course, the devil is in the detail, right? So we then kind of made our commitments that went alongside being an anti-racist organisation. Lots of training, but I note your term around development. So that's something. We, had done an action plan and looking, all the things, Joy, you said, Lord, don't do. But also looking to kind of have a level of accountability that we haven't had before. And some of that is looking beyond the four walls of Westminster, so we're not marking our own homework, and looking at some type of partnership kind of accountability forum that would operate for the place Westminster, that would pull in different kind of partners and kind of key players in the area. But I just wondered if we could, that thing about anti-racism accountability, like what is most effective in terms of seeing accountability for anti-racism, and what is less effective, I suppose, from your kind of from what you've seen. But thank you, like a million thank yous for being here, and I know we will benefit greatly, both those who are on the call and those that we kind of forward the recording to. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Serena. Very deep questions and really good to meet with you. Let me start off with anti-racism, and I don't mean to upset anyone, but I think people have got the idea that not being racist is not the same as being anti-racist. So I think people have kind of clocked this one. But what I've often said to people is, well, what does it mean to be anti-racist? And they say, oh, it means to be active. And I say, active about what? And then people get stumped. So actually, if you understand racism, then what you're trying to do is to be upstream of racism. So you're almost saying, how is it that we prevent racism from happening? So that's the anti bit for me. There's a difference between dealing with the symptoms of racism actively. So when I experience racism, I'm going to get a positive response. People are going to, show me to the right person. The policies are going to work for me, all of that kind of stuff. To stopping racism before it happens. So we have, by we I mean brap, we have some really clear definitions of anti-racism. And often our starting point with organisations when they say we want to declare ourselves as anti-racist is don't do it, organisation. And people look at me like, what do you mean don't do it? I thought you thought it would be a really good thing to do it. But I don't think it's a good thing to do it if organisations don't know what they're doing. Because what happens is it raises this expectation. And as you know, we're getting to 4 years now since George Floyd was murdered, and loads of people, loads of organisations have come out with their anti-racist statements. I can guarantee not very much has happened, although I expect there's been lots of energy, lots of enthusiasm, lots of people being galvanised to be anti-racist. But what is it that we do? And I think unless we can fill that gap, which is what do we do differently about anti-racism that's different from all the other things that we do because we really want to be good people and we want to prevent racism from happening, then there's a huge gap between that intention, that statement, and what organisations really do. Because being anti-racist is hard. It's not it's a bit of a it's hard for our society because our society doesn't want to let go of the things that make it really racist. We don't want to fess up to our role in the slave trade. We don't want to look at our education. We want to believe in this idea of different races. And we don't realise that if we talk about race as a social construct, so race has no biological reality basis, really, what does that mean? That means you're saying that I'm the same as you. So why am I treating you differently? And so that all of that stuff is layering racism within our society. And to be anti-racist, you've got to peel off the things that we have sat with and accepted. And that's hard for organisations to do. It's hard for society to do. Racism is a world issue. It's not an issue that just belongs to London, Westminster. It belongs, to across our society. And every time we see, every time I look at the television, I kind of go, oh gosh, you can see how racism remakes itself. So anti-racism is on making racism. So I'm really happy, Serena, to talk to you about the anti-racist principles and to think about working with them. Because if you don't work with them, despite your intentions, what you do is you're still just treating the symptoms of racism. You're not dealing with the causes. Yeah. And when you then start to deal with the causes of racism, some of that stuff that you talked about in terms of noticing the everyday, asking some of those questions about what's going on for people, they actually become clearer because people begin to recognise that they recognise their role in it. Really, they recognise that I'm still, so like when I saw Serena and she had this wonderful appointment, the first thing I thought was, is she going to be any good at it? And you recognise that some of those thoughts are ingrained in us. Now, it doesn't. What I think what's interesting is when we act on those thoughts, because we all have thoughts, and it's our ability to be able to recognise them and put a brake on it. For some people, they can't put the brake on it. They think there is legitimacy in acting on those thoughts, and that's the stuff that we need to do with organisations. And that's why I say it's development, not training. Yeah. Sorry, that was a bit of a roundabout answer that didn't answer anything.
No, Joy. Listen, I know we've got some time in the diary, but no. I think really just kind of useful. And I think the provocation there about, kind of when to launch, what is a launch? And it's there is a need always to galvanize people. And sometimes we have to look incrementally at the things that we're doing, but completely kind of agree. Signing up to something is great, right? Because morally, whatever, we all feel that it's good, but the devil's in the detail. What does it require me to do? And when you're doing that after we can't turn back, so in one sense it's great. We've got this, we must do it by all means necessary, but now it is, as you say, kind of convenient. So yeah, look forward. I mean, I could just spend the whole time doing my questions, but let me make sure everybody gets an opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
So we've got a question from Alison, and then Patrick will go on to you.
Hi, Joy. Thank you. That was amazing. I found it, really insightful. And picking up on Serena's point and yours about the accountability, I think something that I've noticed, as obviously a white person in the organisation who's been around here for 20 years, is that it's like taking people on that journey. So where you're saying about the development, people can have, go on a training course or whatever, but how do you then take that next step? And we, in my team, which is part of Serena's department, the Sport, Leisure and Active Communities team, we set up our own little group to talk about George Floyd and then everything. And we meet monthly and we sort of share things, whether it's from the sporting world, something that's happened, or just something that's happened just in our lives. But that really helped me to then challenge that in a work setting where we were building a leisure centre and the developer had, come up with these hoardings that were awful, and there were just so many stereotypes, and it was like linking it to Notting, trying to be like, oh, we're close to Notting Hill. And I just remember having this argument with this guy, and he was like, I can't be racist, I'm Indian. And I was like, no, I'm not saying you're racist, but you're completely missing the point here about these hoardings. And then I find other organisations will say, oh, we're anti-racist because we've got an equalities policy. And it's like, well, that isn't being anti-racist. So had this big argument and eventually got them changed. And I put my foot down and was like, I don't care. If you're not going to change them, we're just going to not have them. And you don't get your advertising because you're not, and that for me was like a good example where I felt empowered because of the work that Serena's done with Stuart and from like the executive leadership team. And that's also really helped me in my personal life, where I had, on a neighbour WhatsApp group, one of my neighbours was saying things and he kept referring to everyone by their to global majority people by like, and he was saying stuff like coloured man and Asian taxi driver. And I was like, no one's putting white uneducated. So I went round to his house and like knocked on his door and gave him a little lecture. And he was like, this is what's wrong with the world today. And I was like, no, this is the world. You have to evolve. I'm sorry. It might have been that but in your time, but, you've got a brain. You need to engage with this stuff because knowledge is power and all that. So, yeah, just interesting for the accountability point, I think, is how we all do that in our jobs day to day.
I totally agree with you, Alison. I think education and self-development is really important, not because you want to save Black people, but because you want to save yourselves. You know, the impact of racism, you know, there's an impact of racism on both people from global majority backgrounds and from white people. And it is about how we live and occupy this world together. So there's a lot to learn. There isn't very much that we can look at in terms of track record. We're really good at human beings killing ourselves off and oppressing one another. That's kind of what we do well. So learning to do something different is really important, and it's, you know, it's part of an important agenda. I think if you are going to reclaim your humanity, I think that's what, you know, lots of people need to begin to invest in.
Yeah, big stuff. When there's 100, I think there's 100 conflicts, aren't there, in the world, and loads of them are caused by, you know, race and religion, aren't they? So, but thank you, I really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Alison.
Thank you, Patrick.
Hi, thank you for you know, quite a powerful speech. But I just want to ask your reflections in Jeremy Hunt's recent budget statement. He said councils are facing severe financial pressures, and they have to cut spending on consultants and diversity schemes just to save money. And again, these questions of money and where money are spent in terms of priority becomes a question because of that statement. And I just wonder, what are your reflections on that?
Well, thank you for the question. And I know that because of the way you asked the question, you know that race is a political football. So race and racism is intensely politicized. So we're often not doing things with the best intent. We are doing things to prove a point and to score a point. I think that in terms of that particular statement, I would say that some of the things that we do in the name of equality and diversity and inclusion don't actually work. But that doesn't mean that the simple answer is to sack all the people that do diversity, equality, inclusion. What we have to recognise is that we have a society that's struggling with issues of equity, that's struggling with issues of inclusion, and that is inherently racist, because we're talking about racism today. So the question I would be asking, which is still an outstanding question, is how are we going to deal with it? So you can withdraw the funding, and that can be the kind of simple tick box response. But people's lives are still being destroyed by racism. People are still denied opportunities by racism. People are still having hugely challenging work experiences because of their racist experience. And we know that as a society. So I think the evidence of racism is really clear. What we're not that good at doing, if I'm very honest with you, is we're not very good at trying to take that evidence and put in place things that address it. And that's why it's an easy hit to say, let's get rid of these people. But quite often, what these people are doing is not what they want to do. It's what they're allowed to do. So you're kind of restricted, you're hemmed in to a system where you might say, right, we need to do X. But actually the system's saying, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't upset anybody. You know, you can't bring people out for some more serious development. No, you can't do this, you can't do that. So there's a restriction within the system. So it's almost like the system's marking its own scorecard. Unless we can be more honest and accountable, then all we do is we kind of increase the merry-go-round. I don't know if that kind of helps to articulate the position, but it is a very you know, we don't want to admit how politicized race is, and who's in power and what they say can also really inhibit, or it can actually help to further race equality.
Thank you. Clint, you have your hands up?
Hey, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah,
I
we
see
can hear you.
Yeah.
And we can also
Yeah,
see you.
yeah, I was just the whole kind of discussion around race is not a recent one, obviously. You know, it's been we're saying the same stuff that people were saying 50 years ago and 100 years ago to a large extent, but creating like a lot of new terms for them. And most of the institutions that we work for, their roots are in imperialist kind of profit building mechanisms for bringing wealth back to places like the UK, and are inherently racist. They're built to basically reinforce those racist structures. They work in that kind of way. You know, like the foundations of kind of all of you know modern medicine now pretty much had eugenics kind of built within it, and that goes for economics and how economics works, and that goes for a lot of religious practices as well, and how those are kind of having it all built into it. So to an extent, it feels like sometimes we're trying to fit the concept of anti-racism into a racist system and into racist institutions, and essentially just constantly having to adjust for the difference, you know. So you try to create a pathway to create diversity, but like you say, the inclusion is missing. But even beyond that, I mean, like we have things in society that aren't necessarily inherently needed, but we think that those are needed, like the abolition movement to get rid of prisons now and to be able to like change the way that we deal with justice and education and how communities work is coming from pre-colonial and kind of more global perspectives on how communities should function. So I'm just like in kind of London and Westminster now, we're tweaking like these small things to be able to make like small minor changes to these very racist institutions. So to what extent do we do that for another 50 years and another 100 years, because the ambition of dismantling it completely is too big? And do we just stop doing some of these things and reinvest our energy into saying, actually, there's a different way that communities and people should function with each other? And it's not necessarily always new. Like it's being practiced all over the world, but it's not being given the prominence that it should be given. And how do we approach that? How do we get people to be having a more serious conversation about radical change? Because quite often, like you're saying, we're talking about racist abuse, which is not the problem that we're talking about when we're talking about systemic racism and dismantling structures and creating an anti-racist kind of society.
I think you wrote something in the chat actually, but I couldn't do the thumbs up thing. I was like, oh, that's too technically challenging. I totally applaud everything you've just said. It feels like sometimes for me, who's somebody who's been doing this work for a very long time, I know I look young, but you know, it's been a while now. It feels like I've been shifting deck chairs on the Titanic. And I think for many people, you know, I remember when I had my kids, I thought, oh, they won't have to go through the racism that I had to go through. Kind of need to get off the boat, you know, to get off the boat, to get off the Titanic and actually stop and say, seriously, what are we really doing here? What is it that where do we need to put our energies here? Even some of the things that I think we're involved in currently, it serves an existing system. So some of these huge projects on decolonisation, for example, are going to benefit us in particular. You know, yeah, it might be good to know where that stuff came from, but I really do think we need to think about creating some different movements of change. And there are some models around that. And there are some things that we're trying to do as an organisation to do that. But it becomes so out of step with what we're currently doing in our organisations that it's almost like you're asking for, you know, you're seeing aliens or something. But I do think that's what's needed. It feels like we can continue on this frame for another 100 years. And I don't, you know, we might get to the point where there's more representation, but for lots of people, their lives would not have changed, you know. And so I do think there's something that's very radical that's needed. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's I it's reassuring kind of being in this conversation, just because I think you have to keep moving, obviously, but it just also just feels like it does need something significantly different, and you kind of need to be in a space to be having those conversations and be able to work through it. And yeah, no, it's really, really reassuring kind of hearing you, speaking with you about it.
No, it's good. Yeah, great. Thank you.